Marisol Vega began every shift the same way, by standing still for exactly 10 seconds. She did it just inside the employee entrance, beneath a flickering light that never stayed fixed on one brightness. 10 seconds to breathe. 10 seconds to remind herself that the night would end. 10 seconds to gather the pieces of herself she had scattered throughout the day between packing Mateo's lunch, arguing with the landlord over a leaking sink, and pretending she wasn't tired when her son asked why her eyes always looked sad lately. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, a scent so permanent it felt stitched into the walls. Somewhere far above her, machines beeped in steady rhythms, mechanical heartbeats keeping time for lives she would never know. The sound followed her everywhere, even into sleep, especially into sleep. Marisol pushed her cleaning cart forward, its wheels wobbling slightly to the left. She'd meant to report it months ago, but there was always something more urgent: groceries, Mateo's, shoes, with the soles worn thin. The night shift belonged to people like her, the unseen, the necessary. The hospital transformed after visiting hours, shedding its daytime chaos for something quieter, heavier. Conversations softened, footsteps echoed longer. Grief, instead of screaming, learned how to whisper. Marisol understood that kind of grief, the type that didn't demand attention, only endurance. She started on the 4th floor, oncology. Not because anyone told her to, but because it felt right to begin where hope and despair shared the same narrow beds. Her mop slid across the floor in slow, practiced strokes. She worked carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. Mistakes were expensive when you lived this close to the edge. A missed shift. A bad impression. One wrong word to the wrong supervisor. She watched her reflection ripple faintly in the polished tile's dark hair, pulled into a low bun. Faint lines at the corners of her eyes, she pretended not to notice. 34 wasn't old, she knew that. But it felt older when you carried responsibility the way she did, like a second spine pressing down on your back. A nurse passed her without looking, already halfway through a conversation on her phone. Marisol stepped aside automatically, shrinking into the wall as she always did. It wasn't bitterness that made her invisible, it was habit. People learned early who the world expected them to see, and who it trained them to look through. She didn't resent it, not most days. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Mateo. She smiled before she even checked the message. Abuela says goodnight. I did my homework. Don't forget pancakes tomorrow. Her chest tightened, that familiar ache blooming just beneath her ribs. Pancakes tomorrow meant she'd sleep for hours, maybe 5 if luck was generous. It meant flipping batter with heavy eyelids, and pretending exhaustion was just another word for normal. I won't forget, she typed back. Love you to the moon. She slid the phone away, steadied herself, and returned to work. Further down the hall, glass walls framed private suites rooms reserved for donors, politicians, and people whose names were spoken carefully. The lighting there was warmer, softer. Even pain looked different behind that kind of glass. Marisol paused near one of those rooms, adjusting the trash liner. Inside, a man sat alone near the window, city lights scattered behind him like spilled constellations. He wore a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, but it hung on him loosely, like it didn't quite belong. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was just still. Something about that stillness tugged at her attention. Not curiosity. Recognition. For a moment, just when their eyes met through the glass. He looked surprised, as if he'd forgotten other people existed. Then he nodded, polite and distant, the way men like him were trained to be. Marisol nodded back, the smallest acknowledgement. She turned away, heart thudding softly, unsure why that brief exchange lingered longer than it should have. By the time she reached the end of the hall, she'd shaken it off. People came and went, out, rich or poor. They all left the same scuff marks on the floors. She wrung out her mop, listening to the water splash back into the bucket. The sound grounded her. This was her world: quiet labor, steady motion, survival measured in shifts completed and bills paid on time. Tomorrow, Mateo would wake up and ask if she was tired. She would smile and say, a little. She always did. Marisol pushed her cart forward, unaware that this ordinary night, this routine, she trusted like a fragile promise, was already cracking open. The floors remembered footsteps, and tonight they were about to remember hers. The first thing Marisol noticed about the man in the glass room was how wrong the silence felt around him. It wasn't the peaceful kind that settled over the hospital after midnight, when even the grief seemed to lower its voice. This silence pressed in on itself, heavy and watchful, as if it were guarding something that didn't want to be found. She passed the room twice before she allowed herself to look again. Security stood outside now, two men in dark suits with earpieces curled tight against their necks. They didn't speak. They didn't lean. They were statues trained to breathe. One of them glanced at her cart as she rolled past, eyes sharp but disinterested. Janitors weren't threats. They never were. Marisol kept her head down, hands busy. She wiped the door handle, replaced a trash liner, cleaned the spotless floor like she'd been taught. Work was safety. Work was invisibility. Inside the room, the man sat at a small table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. He hadn't changed position since earlier. His jacket was off now, draped over the back of the chair, sleeves creased like he'd been wearing it for days. His tie was loosened, the knot tugged down just enough to hint at frustration rather than comfort. He looked tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Marisol wasn't supposed to know his name, she hadn't asked. But names traveled fast in places like this, whispered by nurses and murmured by orderlies who liked to feel close to importance. Elliot Crane, the billionaire. The lawsuit. The threats. She didn't care about any of that. Not really. Money had always been a distant planet bright, unreachable, and irrelevant to her gravity. What she noticed instead was the way his fingers tapped the table in uneven rhythms, as if he were counting something only he could hear. The way his eyes kept drifting to the door, then the window, then back again. Trapped in a room large enough to be a small apartment, Marisol finished her task and moved on, but the image followed her down the corridor. Loneliness wore many faces, she knew. This one just happened to be expensive. Later, she found herself assigned to the private wing longer than usual. A spill, someone said. Extra sanitizing. She didn't question it. She rarely did. As she worked, she overheard a nurse speaking softly to another near the medication station. He won't sleep, the nurse said. Refuses anything stronger than coffee. Paranoid? Marisol pressed her mop harder than necessary, the bristles squeaking faintly. She understood paranoia too, the way fear lodged itself into your muscles and refused to let go. The way it taught you to listen for danger even when nothing was there. When she passed the glass room again, Elliot was standing now, phone pressed to his ear. No, he said sharply. I'm not moving. This place is supposed to be secure. A pause, because hiding isn't the same as living. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a brittle edge, stretched thin by too many decisions made alone. Marisol pretended not to hear, eyes fixed on the floor as she moved past. Her chest tightened anyway. There was something familiar in that tone, the sound of someone who had run out of patience, but couldn't he afford to run out of control? An hour later, she found him in the hallway. It startled her enough that she nearly dropped her cloth. He stood near the window at the end of the corridor. City lights reflected faintly in the glass behind him. Security lingered at a distance, giving him space but not freedom. He didn't look at her when she approached, just watched the city breathe beneath the dark sky. Sorry, she said automatically, angling her cart to pass. He turned then, clearly surprised by her presence. Up close, he looked different, less polished, more human. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes. A tension in his jaw that suggested sleepless nights and decisions that never stayed solved. It's fine, he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Should have been watching where I was standing. She nodded, already moving on. But something made him add, you work nights. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said, pausing despite herself. He glanced at her cart, then at her face. Not with judgment, with curiosity. Doesn't it get heavy? The word lingered between them. All the time, she answered honestly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hospital hummed around them, alive and indifferent. Well, he said finally, a faint, humorless smile touching his mouth, you make it look manageable. Marisol didn't know why that stayed with her after she walked away. She didn't know why. Hours later, as she finished her shift and stepped into the cool pre-dawn air, she thought of a man surrounded by guards and glass, unable to sleep. Invisible people noticed things others didn't. And Elliot Crane, for all his money, had never looked more exposed. The night shifted without warning. Marisol felt it first in her shoulders, the way they tightened, as if her body had sensed something before her mind caught up. The hospital hadn't grown louder or quieter, not really, but the air felt sharper, thinner, like the moment before a storm breaks. She was restocking supplies near the service elevator, humming softly under her breath when the voices reached her.
Oh.
They weren't meant to be heard. Two men stood just inside the stairwell door, its heavy frame left open a fraction too wide. Their words slid out into the corridor, low and clipped, sharpened by urgency. Not hospital voices, not tired nurses or bored security guards. Won't have another chance, one said. Marisol's hand stilled on the shelf. He's isolated tonight, the other replied. He's too confident in the building. A pause. Then a sound that made her stomach drop, a faint metallic click, quick and deliberate. Her heart began to race. She should have walked away. She knew that. Every instinct she had learned over 34 careful years screamed at her to mind her business, to shrink back into her cart and disappear. This was not her fight, not her world. But fear had a way of pulling memories to the surface. Deo, standing in the doorway that morning, backpack slipping off one shoulder. Don't forget pancakes, he'd said, hopeful and trusting. Her fingers curled slowly around the edge of the shelf. She leaned just enough to see them. Two men, dark coats, gloves. One of them slipped something small and unmistakably solid into his pocket. The way he moved was practiced, efficient, dangerous. They turned toward the hallway that led to the private suites. Toward Elliot Crane. Marisol's pulse thundered in her ears. She tasted copper. Her thoughts scattered, crashing into one another with no clear path through. Security was nearby, but not close enough. Not watching the right corridor. Not now. She had seconds. Maybe less. Her legs felt heavy as she stepped back, heart slamming against her ribs. This was how people got hurt, by seeing something they weren't meant to see. By thinking they could help. Her hand brushed her phone in her pocket. Call someone. Anyone. But by the time anyone arrived, it would be too late. The men moved again, quiet as shadows. Marisol didn't think. She moved. Her cart rattled softly as she pushed it forward, deliberately loud, deliberately present. She turned down the hallway toward the private wing, pulse roaring, breath shallow. Her mind raced through impossible options. Scream, run, warn someone, block the door. None of them felt right. None of them felt fast enough. Elliot stepped into the corridor ahead of her, flanked loosely by security who lingered several steps behind. He looked distracted, phone in hand, his attention fractured by whatever battle he was fighting on the other end of the line. The men from the stairwell slowed. Their eyes tracked him. Tracked her. Marisol's chest tightened painfully. She was in it now. There was no backing out, no pretending she hadn't seen. Her feet carried her forward, faster than she intended. Her heart screamed so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Elliot looked up just as she reached him. Confusion crossed his face, followed by something like recognition. Before he could speak, before her courage had time to dissolve into fear, she did the only thing her body seemed to understand. She grabbed his jacket and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't graceful. Her mouth pressed to his, with a desperation that startled them both. She felt his breath hitch, his body go rigid in shock beneath her hands. Gasps rippled down the hallway. Someone swore. The men from the stairwell froze, their line of sight broken, their timing shattered. One of them muttered something sharp and angry under his breath. For a heartbeat, Elliot didn't move. Then slowly, deliberately, his hand came up, resting at her elbow. Not possessive, not forceful, playing along. Security surged forward, voices raised, confusion erupting in the tight corridor. The moment fractured, splintered into chaos. Marisol pulled back, breath shaking, eyes wide. Elliot stared at her, stunned. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't know what else to do." Before he could respond, the guards were between them, questions firing, hands reaching for earpieces. The men from the stairwell were going to melt back into shadows, as if they'd never been there at all. Marisol's knees threatened to give out. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had saved a stranger's life. She had no idea what it was about to cost her. The aftermath moved faster than Marisol could follow. Hands guided her away, firm but not rough. Voices layered over one another in sharp bursts of sound. Security radios crackled. Someone asked her name. Someone else asked if she knew the man she had kissed. The corridor that had held its breath moments earlier now buzzed with urgency, like a hive struck too hard. Marisol's heart refused to slow. It beat wildly, painfully, as if it were trying to escape her chest altogether. Her mouth felt dry, her limbs strangely light, as though she were no longer entirely inside them. She kept looking back. Elliot stood a few feet away, ringed by security, his expression unreadable. One guard murmured something into his ear, while another scanned the hall, eyes sharp and searching. For a moment, their gazes met again across the chaos. This time, there was no polite nod. There was shock, and something else in awareness that hadn't been there before. They ushered her into a small administrative office near the elevators. The door shut with a soft but final click that made her stomach twist. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. A single desk sat beneath buzzing lights, paperwork stacked too neatly at one end. Marisol sank into the chair they offered, hands clenched in her lap. "What were you thinking?" Security officer asked, not unkindly, just exhausted. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" She nodded, because arguing felt impossible. "Yes." Another man leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Do you know Mr. Crane?" "No," she said quickly. "I didn't. I mean, I know who he is, but then why?" The first officer pressed. Her throat tightened. "Did you explain instinct? The way fear sometimes sharpened into clarity instead of paralysis?" "Give us a moment," he said. It wasn't a request. The officers hesitated, then filed out, closing the door behind them. The quiet that followed felt louder than any alarm. Marisol stood, nerves buzzing. "I'm sorry," she said again, words tumbling out. "I shouldn't have, didn't think I'd just stop," Elliot said gently. She froze. "You don't apologize for that," he said. "You saved my life." He exhaled slowly, as if the rest of the sentence was too heavy to finish. "I know," he said again, and this time there was no hesitation. "You did it because you couldn't walk away." Something in his voice cracked open the tight knot in her chest. Tears threatened, unwelcome and dangerous. She blinked them back fiercely. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Elliot studied her for a long moment, as if weighing a future neither of them had planned. "Oh," he said, "you're not going to lose your job. You're not going to be treated like a problem to be managed." She shook her head. "I don't want anything from you." And somewhere deep inside, she knew the quiet life she had so carefully protected was already slipping out of reach. Marisol didn't sleep when she got home. She lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling that ran from the corner of the bedroom toward the light fixture like a fault line. Her body kept replaying the moment, hands on fabric that wasn't hers. The shock of warmth, the way the world had tilted when she realized there was no one doing what she'd done. She turned onto her side, facing Mateo's room. The door was open just enough to let a sliver of nightlight spill into the hallway. He was asleep, sprawled diagonally across his bed, one arm flung over his pillow like he was holding on to something invisible. That was when it hit her. Not the fear of losing her job. Her chest tightened until breathing hurt. By morning, the city looked exactly the same. People rushed past with coffee cups and headphones. A woman argued with her child on the bus. Someone laughed too loudly on a street corner. The world had not shifted on its axis just because Marisol Vega had kissed a stranger to stop him from being killed. That almost made it worse. She made pancakes anyway. Burned the first batch. Mateo didn't complain. "You look tired," he said around a mouthful of syrup. She smiled. "I am. Did something scary happen at work?" The question landed softly, but it found its mark. She hesitated, then nodded. "A little." Marisol closed her eyes and held him until the ache loosened enough to let her breathe again. The hospital felt different when she returned that night. Not hostile, not exactly welcoming either, just aware. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford to show. The office was larger than the one from the night before, with framed certificates lining the walls and a window that overlooked the parking lot. 2 managers sat behind the desk. A security officer stood near the door. Marisol said nothing. But given the circumstances, the other continued, in the confirmation of a credible threat. "We're not pursuing disciplinary action." Relief washed through her so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. "You're free to return to your duties," the manager added. "However, due to ongoing security concerns, certain precautions will be taken." Marisol looked at Elliot despite herself. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, meeting her gaze. "But it's not optional." When the meeting ended, he walked with her partway down the hall. Not too close, not distant either. A careful balance. "They're going to watch you," she said. "Talk about me." "They already are," he answered. "That won't stop." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I don't want my life rearranged because of yours." Something flickered across his face, guilt, sharp and immediate. "Neither do I." They stood there. 2 people bound by a moment neither of them could erase. Elliot nodded once. "And everything I do next will take that into account." She didn't find it. Instead, she saw exhaustion and something like resolve. Marisol turned back toward her cart. "Then don't make promises you can't keep." He watched her walk away, mop bucket rattling softly behind her, and for the first time in a long while, Elliot Crane felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. And everything to do with a woman who had stepped into danger without hesitation and was now trying, quietly, to hold her life together as if nothing had happened at all. The precautions arrived quietly, the way storms sometimes did without thunder, without warning, just a subtle shift in the air that made everything feel watched. Marisol noticed the camera first. It hadn't been there before, mounted discreetly near the ceiling at the end of the corridor outside the private wing. She paused with her mop mid-stroke, staring at the small black lens angled just enough to see her. She didn't like it. By the time she reached the supply room, she'd counted 3 more. Security guards rotated more frequently now, faces unfamiliar, postures alert. They greeted her by name. That unsettled her more than if they'd ignored her. "Evening, Miss Vega," she nodded, lips pressed together. Being known was different from being seen. Elliot's presence lingered everywhere without him actually being there. Meetings whispered about in break rooms. Emails passed down through supervisors with carefully chosen language. Asterisk, temporary measures. Asterisk, asterisk, out of an abundance of caution. She finished her rounds early and found herself in the staff cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. She checked her phone twice. No messages from Mateo yet. School night. He'd be asleep soon. "Mind if I sit?" The voice startled her enough that she nearly spilled the coffee. Elliot stood a few steps away, jacket slung over his shoulder, sleeves rolled up like he'd forgotten to care how he looked. No guards hovered nearby. That alone felt like a risk. "I do mind," she said honestly. He accepted that with a small nod. "Fair." He turned to leave. "Sit," she added, surprising herself. He did. They faced each other across the small table, the hum of vending machines filling the silence. Up close, she could see the strain etched into his face more clearly than before. He looked like someone who had been bracing for impact for far too long. "They told me you're uncomfortable," he said. She snorted softly. "That's one word for it. I can have them scale things back." "No," she said quickly. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "I don't like feeling like I'm part of something I don't understand." He leaned back slightly. "Neither do one something about that." Cracked the tension, just a little. "They keep asking me questions," she continued. "Where I go? What time I leave? Who watches my son?" Regret flashed across his features. "I'm sorry. You keep saying that, because I mean it." She studied him for a long moment. "Why stay here? You could be anywhere, safer places, quieter ones." He looked down at his hands. "Because hiding doesn't make the threat go away, just teaches it where you'll run." Her lips pressed together. That sounded like something learned the hard way. "My life was already small," she said. "Careful, predictable. Now it feels loud." "I don't want to make it louder," he said softly. "But I won't pretend it didn't intersect with mine." She nodded slowly. "I don't need protection." "I know," he replied without hesitation. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He hesitated. "Accountability." The word settled between them. She finished her coffee and stood. "Have to work, of course." As she walked away, he added, "For what it's worth, I don't regret meeting you." She paused but didn't turn around. "Don't confuse gratitude with entitlement." "I won't." The rest of the shift passed in a blur of motion and thought. When she finally clocked out, the sky was lightening at the edges, dawn bleeding softly into night. Outside, the air was cool and damp. She breathed deeply, letting the weight of the building fall from her shoulders. A car idled near the curb. Not following, not waiting, just there. She wrapped her jacket tighter and walked past it, heart steady despite everything. Marisol Vega had lived her whole life in the space between risk and necessity. She would not let fear decide which side she belonged to now. The whispers found her before the headlines did. They followed her down corridors and into break rooms, slipped into conversations that paused just a beat too late when she entered. People smiled differently now, curious smiles, cautious ones. Some held a trace of admiration. Others carried judgment, thinly disguised as concern. Marisol learned which was worse. She kept her head down the way she always had, but it didn't work anymore. Being invisible after being noticed was harder than never being seen at all. A nurse she barely knew stopped her near the elevators. "You okay?" she asked, voice soft, eyes searching. "I'm fine," Marisol said automatically. The nurse hesitated. "That was brave." "What you did?" Marisol nodded, unsure how to respond. Bravery implied choice. She still wasn't certain she'd had one. By midweek, her name appeared online. She found it by accident, scrolling while waiting for Mateo outside his classroom. A headline framed her story like something unreal, something shaped for clicks and speculation. Asterisk, mystery woman kisses tech mogul during hospital scare. Asterisk, There was no photo of her face. Thank God, but there was enough detail to make her stomach twist. She locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket just as Mateo ran toward her, backpack bouncing, smile wide and unguarded. "Mom." She knelt and hugged him tightly, breathing in the clean, familiar scent of soap and crayons. That night she cried in the kitchen. Not loudly. Not the kind of crying that demanded attention. Just silent tears that slipped down her face while the kettle boiled and the apartment slept. She wasn't ashamed of what she'd done. She was afraid of what the world might decide it meant. The message from Elliot came late, after she'd already crawled into bed. Asterisk, "I'm sorry. I should have warned you this would happen." Asterisk. She stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Asterisk, "I didn't do it for attention." Asterisk, the response came quickly. Asterisk, "I know, and I won't let this touch your son." Asterisk, her throat tightened. Promises again. Heavy ones. The next day at work, a supervisor pulled her aside, not disciplinary, just procedural. Extra forms, extra questions, everything wrapped in careful politeness. "You can request time off if this becomes overwhelming," the supervisor said. Marisol shook her head. "I need the hours." The truth settled heavily between them. The world might have room for scandal and speculation, but it rarely made space for single mothers who couldn't afford to step away. Later that night, she found Elliot in the hospital chapel. He sat in the back pew, jacket draped beside him, hands clasped loosely, head bowed, but eyes open. The room was empty except for them, candlelight flickering softly against stone walls. "I didn't think you prayed," she said quietly. "I don't," he replied. "I just sit here when I need to remember I'm not in control." She lowered herself into the pew behind him. "You're talking about me, I know. You said you wouldn't let it affect my son, and it won't," he said firmly. "I've already taken steps." She leaned forward, voice low. "I don't want him growing up thinking everything has a price." Elliot turned then, fully facing her. "Neither do I for a moment." Neither spoke. The silence between them felt different. Here less threatening, more honest. "They see a story," she said. "They don't see me." His expression softened. "I do." The words landed gently, but with weight. She held his gaze, searching for motive for calculation. She didn't find it. Instead, she saw a man stripped of certainty, standing in the quiet aftermath of something he hadn't known he needed until it existed. Marisol stood. "I need to get back to work." He nodded. "Thank you for sitting with me." She paused at the doorway. "Don't let them turn me into something I'm not." "I won't," he said. And for the first time since that night in the hallway, Marisol allowed herself to believe him not, because he was powerful, but because he was finally listening. The call came just after noon, slicing through Marisol's routine with surgical precision. She was wiping down the kitchen counter, the radio murmuring softly in the background, when her phone buzzed against the laminate. She almost ignored it, habit more than intention, but something in her chest tightened before she even saw the number. Unknown. "Hello?" she answered, keeping her voice steady. After the call ended, she sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The radio clicked off automatically. Silence rushed in to fill the space, loud and merciless. This was the line. She'd crossed into danger herself without hesitation, but Mateo was sacred ground. There was no surprise in his tone, only anger, sharp and tightly controlled. "I'm already on my way to you." By the time he arrived, the storm had broken inside her. She paced the living room, arms wrapped around herself, breathing shallowly. When he stepped through the door, she didn't bother with politeness. "I failed you," he said, without defensiveness, without excuse. "I thought control meant protection," he said. She exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to let her stand upright again. "I won't forgive you if my son ever feels unsafe," she said. "I wouldn't expect you to," he answered. They stood there in the quiet apartment, the city humming softly beyond the windows. For the first time since the hallway, since the kiss that had fractured her life into before and after, Marisol felt the future shift, not toward danger, but toward possibility. Not because the threat was gone, because someone had finally chosen to face it head-on instead of letting her stand alone in its shadow. Time didn't rush them after that. It settled. Days passed without sirens, without unfamiliar footsteps lingering too long outside Marisol's building. Mateo walked to school without extra eyes watching from across the street. The knot in Marisol's chest loosened slowly, the way muscles did after being held too tight for too long. She didn't call it peace, not yet, but it was close enough to breathe. Elliot didn't disappear after the press conference. He didn't retreat behind gates or assistants, or the convenient distance money often bought. Instead, he learned how to exist quietly in her world, carefully, imperfectly. He came by once with groceries because he'd noticed her fridge was always half empty. She sent him away with half of them because she wouldn't TB someone's charity case. He accepted that without offense, only a nod and a soft, "fair enough." Another evening, he sat at her small kitchen table while she helped Mateo with math homework. He watched more than he spoke, as if afraid to disturb the fragile normalcy unfolding in front of him. "You're doing it wrong," Mateo announced suddenly, pointing at Elliot's paper. Elliot blinked. "I am?" "Yes," Mateo said seriously. "You have to carry the two." Elliot actually laughed, caught off guard by being corrected by an 8-year-old with a pencil smudge on his cheek. Marisol watched the moment carefully, her heart tightening in a way that surprised her. This wasn't rescue. This wasn't a grand gesture. This was presence. Later that night, after Mateo was asleep, they sat on the fire escape outside her apartment. The city hummed below them, alive and indifferent, the air cool against their skin. "You could leave," Marisol said, breaking the silence. "Go back to your life. This is my life now," Elliot replied. "At least the honest part of it." She studied him, searching for the edges of performance, for the subtle signs of obligation. She'd learned to read people out of necessity. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He exhaled. "I want to stop treating connection like a liability. I want something real enough to be inconvenient." She smiled faintly. "That's a strange thing to want." "It's a terrifying thing," he said. They sat with that truth between them. Marisol thought of all the years she delived, braced for loss, how she debuilt her life like a narrow bridge, wide enough only for survival, never for hope. Love had always felt like a luxury, like something that belonged to people with safety nets. "I don't fall easily," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to fall," Elliot replied. "Just stand here with me." She turned to him then, really looked at him. Not the billionaire, not the man from the headlines. Just a man who had chosen to be accountable instead of powerful. She reached out and took his hand. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sparks, no urgency. It's just warmth, steady, certain. "I'm not broken," she said. "I know," he answered immediately. "You never were." The words settled deep, undoing something she hadn't realized was knotted so tightly inside her. When she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, it felt like choosing rest instead of surrender. Love didn't save them. It met them where they already stood, bruised, wary, still standing. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Morning came softly, the way it always did after long nights, without apology, without ceremony. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Marisol's apartment, painting pale gold across the walls and the scuffed hardwood floor. The city outside was already awake, engines humming, doors opening, lives moving forward, as if nothing monumental had ever happened in a hospital hallway weeks ago. Marisol stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug, listening to Mateo chatter behind her as he packed his backpack. "You're coming today, right?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder. "I wouldn't miss it." Mateo grinned, satisfied, and zipped his bag with a triumphant tug. He looked lighter lately, less watchful. Children carried fear differently, but they shed it faster to when the world let them. When Elliot knocked, it wasn't the sharp, formal sound of someone announcing themselves. It was gentle, almost hesitant. Mateo beat her to the door. "You're early," he said seriously, as if this were a rule Elliot should have known. Elliot smiled. "Oh, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything important." Marisol watched them from the kitchen doorway, arms folded loosely across her chest. This quiet choreography of normalcy still startled her sometimes. She'd spent so many years managing life alone that sharing it felt like learning a new language. They walked together to the school, the sidewalk warm beneath their feet, the air carrying the scent of bread from a nearby bakery. Elliot didn't hold her hand. He walked beside her, close enough to be present, far enough to leave space. When Mateo disappeared through the school doors, he turned back and waved once hard and fast. Like he was afraid the moment might slip away, Marisol waved until he was gone. "You okay?" Elliot asked. She nodded. "I am." They didn't rush after that. They let the day open slowly, wandering toward the hospital where it had all begun. Marisol hadn't been back on a morning shift in years. The building looked different in daylight, less ominous, more human. Inside, people moved with purpose, coffee cups in hand, laughter breaking through exhaustion. No one stared. No one whispered. She walked the same hallway she'd cleaned so many nights before. The floors gleamed, reflecting the light in soft, forgiving ways. For a moment, she imagined her past self here, head down, cart rattling, heart braced. She felt something loosen in her chest. Elliot stopped near the window at the end of the corridor, the same one where he'd once stood alone, surrounded by guards and glass. "I used to think places like this were temporary," he said. "Stops along the way to something better." Marisol joined him. "They're not." "No," he agreed. "There were things happen." They stood together, watching a nurse guide an elderly patient down the hall, their steps slow but steady. Marisol took a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. Her life wasn't suddenly easy. Bills still waited. Nights would still be long. Fear hadn't vanished. It had just learned where it belonged. But she was no longer invisible. Not to herself. Not to her son. Not to the man beside her who had chosen truth over comfort, presence over power. When she turned toward the exit, Elliot followed without question. The floors remembered footsteps. They remembered the quiet ones, the brave ones, the ones that passed through unnoticed. And now, they remembered hers as something else entirely, not a trace left behind, but a path forward, lit by morning and steady with hope.